Major General Yoshitaka Furushima had read the terrain like scripture. Every ridge, ravine, and muddy channel across northern Luzon had been memorized, walked, and marked with symbols on worn paper maps. The Japanese High Command believed this highland region would be the graveyard of American armor, a place where machines would stall, rust, and vanish under the canopy of ancient trees and monsoon floods. And for the first few months, that belief had held. Oxen still pulled sleds of artillery. Soldiers still carried crates of mortar shells on their backs. The jungle was their ally, unchanged, unruly, unbeatable. But now, Furushima stood at a ridgeline once thought impassable, binoculars pressed tightly to his eyes, heart thumping not from fear but from disbelief. Below, in the churned mud of the valley floor, came a line of American jeeps, boxy, stubby machines with balloon-like tires and steel grills like snarling mouths. They moved through the mud like it was rice water. They didn't bog down. They didn't wait for sun. They didn't even need roads. One of the jeeps bounced over a collapsed log bridge, dipped into a washout, then climbed the opposite bank without slowing. Furushima watched as the driver, bareheaded and grinning, threw the machine into reverse, spun its rear tires into a spray of mud, and repositioned under a stand of palms with a motion that was almost playful. It should have been impossible. Nearby, Corporal Inoue crouched under a torn tarp, shielding his notebook from the drizzle as he jotted angle calculations, tire patterns, and timings. The numbers didn't add up. Japanese scouts had calculated those slopes as artillery-only zones. No cart, no horse, no man with sense would try to ascend from that side. Yet the Americans came from there, not only surviving, but delivering supplies and mortar rounds directly behind Japanese lines. The young corporal paused, watching his general. "Shall I report this to Northern Command, sir?" Furushima didn't answer. Not immediately. His eyes followed the next jeep, this one covered in camouflage netting, trailing radio wire and what looked like an entire antenna array on its rear. Another odd detail, the vehicle had no animal, no harness, no cart, just a man and a motor, moving like a creature of its own will. He slowly lowered the binoculars and took in the sorry state of his own logistics. Thin men pulling bamboo sleds, exhausted oxen collapsing in mud, crates of ammunition soaked beyond use. Inoue broke the silence again. "They call them jeeps. I heard the name over the American broadcast. They said it's short for something. A letter designation. I think Furushima ignored the explanation. The problem was bigger than nomenclature. Tokyo's entire war doctrine had dismissed such machines. They were mocked as indulgent, fragile, made for Western roads and peacetime posturing. Reports called them noisy toys or over-engineered wagons. The Imperial High Command believed mobility in Asia still belonged to the infantryman, the pack horse, the rice-fed foot soldier who knew the land and respected its wildness. But this was a new language of war, and Japan had not learned to speak it. The general turned slowly, walking back toward his command post, little more than a dugout beneath sagging jungle branches. Rainwater trickled down the back of his collar. He didn't shiver. His mind was too hot with thoughts. They had trained for years on the belief that nature was a constant, that rain would halt tanks, that slopes would resist steel, that mud would slow the enemy like it slowed their own men. But they hadn't accounted for the Americans bringing a machine designed for precisely this defiance. A machine that didn't challenge the terrain. It embraced it, danced with it, laughed through it. A younger officer saluted him near the dugout. Furushima waved him off. Back at the edge of the ridge, another jeep began its ascent. This one with wounded on stretchers lashed to its sides. It hit a rock, bounced, spun slightly, and then reversed uphill, wheels clawing through wet earth like some stubborn animal from legend. It didn't need horses. It didn't need belief. Furushima watched, heart heavy. "We are defending the past while they drive the future." It was the first time a machine made me feel like we were already ghosts. Private Harold Kessler was no war hero. Not by rank, not by medals, not by the kind of stories that reached front pages back home. He was a skinny farm kid from rural Ohio, just 19 years old, with straw-colored hair that clung to his forehead in the thick Pacific heat. He had no illusions about glory. When the draft papers came, he didn't argue, didn't panic. He packed a duffel bag, kissed his mother's cheek, and boarded the train. He was assigned to the 161st Engineering Corps, which sounded grand to the boys in boot camp but meant something simpler on the battlefield. He was the man who kept the jeeps alive. While others carried rifles and stormed beaches, Harold carried metal cans. 5 gallons each, sometimes 2, strapped over his shoulders like cruel saddlebags. His hands were constantly raw, blistered from heat, torn by can handles, blackened by fuel. The jeeps, they said, were what gave America its edge, small, fast, sturdy. But they didn't run on hope or strategy. They ran on men like Harold. The jungle was no place for machines. The heat warped tires. Mud swallowed engines. Gas evaporated faster than it could be poured. And yet every morning, Harold rose before the sun, boots still wet from the day before, and began his route. He knew every ridge and ravine by name, nicknames given by other fuel runners who had limped back with empty cans or never returned at all. One jeep, a squat little beast with a crooked front fender and a tendency to choke on inclines, had become his favorite. He named her Lulu, after his younger sister back in Ohio, who used to sneak caramel candies into his lunch pail before school. He scrawled her name on the hood with axle grease, even added a star with his thumbprint as a joke. She became his unofficial assignment. If Lulu stalled, it was Harold who coaxed her back to life. The engineers had a saying, "It's not the generals who take the hill, it's the jeeps who get them there." But the truth was even deeper. It was boys like Harold, dragging gasoline through sniper zones, who made the climb possible. They weren't written about in HQ bulletins. Their names weren't radioed back to Washington. But without them, every advance would grind to a halt in the mud. When something broke, and it always did, Harold didn't wait for parts. He scavenged from wrecks, shaped sheet metal with rocks, cut fuel lines from dead vehicles, and sealed leaks with chewing gum. His wrench was his rifle. His engine oil was his armor. The day Lulu died, the sky was wet with smoke and thunder. A Japanese mortar, fired blindly from a ridgeline, landed square on her wheelbase. Harold wasn't inside, he was 30 feet away, fueling another jeep. The blast tossed him into a gulch, ribs bruised, knees torn open. When he crawled back to the clearing, all that remained was her frame, cracked open like an egg. The grease-lettered name melted into black ruin. He didn't cry. He didn't scream. He didn't even stop moving. He limped to another damaged vehicle, a jeep half buried in a collapsed trail, and began clearing debris from its chassis. That night, he sat by a lantern writing a letter to his sister Lulu. It was brief, just a few lines about how the jungle smelled like metal and how he missed the sound of the Ohio wind. He didn't mention the jeep. He didn't tell her that, in a way, he'd buried her name in a blast crater halfway across the world. Command never saw Harold. His name didn't make after-action reports. His contribution wasn't measured in kills or captured flags. But every time a unit pushed forward, every time a squad was evacuated from fire, every time a general's orders arrived on time, it was because someone had carried fuel, wrench, and willpower through terrain that ate machines whole. The war was built on machines, but machines didn't move on their own. They think the machines fight the war, but it's hands, skin, and gasoline that make them move. In the dense interior of southern Luzon, where Mount Isarog's volcanic ridges twisted like the spine of a sleeping beast, Lieutenant Saburo Aizawa held command over a company of exhausted, half-starved men. Their sanctuary was not a fortress, but a warren, fortified caves bored into the volcanic rock, camouflaged by moss, overhanging vines, and the smoke of cooking fires barely kept alight. The air inside was always damp. Earthworms slipped through cracks in the stone walls. The men slept on bamboo mats beside boxes of corroding ammunition. Discipline, once strict, had begun to erode under the weight of rain, darkness, and the constant threat of discovery. But on that particular morning, something curious arrived, carried on the humid wind from the American perimeter line. Propaganda. Folded leaflets, soaked at the edges, fluttered down the ravine and caught against the roots of a breadfruit tree. One soldier retrieved it. Another read it aloud. Aizawa took it with a scowl and studied the strange image on the front. A cartoon jeep grinning like a mischievous child, scaling a volcano, waving a tiny American flag. The absurdity of it cracked something open among the men. Laughter echoed through the caves, not the cruel laughter of victory, but the thin, brittle humor of those too weary to cry. "They believe machines are beasts," Aizawa said aloud, handing the leaflet back with disdain. "Let them try to feed one through these tunnels." Yet, beneath the sarcasm, Aizawa felt something gnawing. 3 days earlier, their last functioning radio had gone silent, cut off after a short burst of static and a sputtered report from a forward patrol. His supply runners, 3 young privates with bound feet and dwindling courage, had not returned from the lower ridge. He feared the worst, but there were no replacements. Tokyo's orders had been clear: hold the mountain. Mount Izarog was high ground, strategic, impregnable. Maps showed no road up its steeper sides. Intelligence reported the American tanks far behind the front line, choked in mud and jungle. Vehicles couldn't climb here. But intelligence, Aizawa knew too well, was a polite word for guesswork. By the second morning after the leaflet, rain swept in heavier than usual, thundering on the leaves and pouring down the jungle canopy like a curtain. Aizawa sat at the cave's mouth, cleaning his Nambu pistol with a cloth rag that had once been part of a uniform sleeve. The scent of mildew mixed with boiled rice. A distant sound caught his ear, low at first, rhythmic, like drums. He froze. It wasn't drums. Rubber on roots, gears grinding against incline, engine heat pushing through soaked air. At first, he thought it was thunder. Then a voice, American, sharp with command. And then he saw it. Not on the road below, but above the ridge. A squat green jeep rolled into view between the banyan trees, its wheels wrapped in mesh, its hood streaked with mud and ferns. Behind it came another and another. No trail, no road. They had come through the jungle, not around the hill, but over it. Aizawa had positioned his men facing downhill, where all logic said the enemy must arrive. The tunnels, designed to channel gunfire toward the path below, were defenseless from above. The Americans had bypassed their entire formation. The ridgeline exploded with gunfire and smoke as jeeps disgorged soldiers with flamethrowers and mortars. The fortified caves, with their narrow mouths and stale air, became traps. Inside, chaos. Men stumbled, blinded by gas and flame. A tunnel collapsed. Screams echoed in the dark. Aizawa ordered a retreat, not to regroup, but to survive. He scrambled through the rear tunnel exit, barefoot, one boot lost to a collapsed floor, his hands bleeding from a fall against a broken crate. He did not stop until the trees swallowed him. Later that night, hiding among the ferns with only a rusted canteen and the echo of collapse in his ears, Aizawa remembered the cartoon jeep. He did not laugh. Mockery is a dangerous weapon, but it always breaks first against surprise. Sergeant Wallace "Wally" Emmons wasn't the kind of man you'd expect to find in the middle of a jungle war. Before enlisting, he'd spent most of his life inside his father's garage in Springfield, Missouri, grease under his nails, radio humming jazz in the background, and engine parts spread across the concrete floor like puzzle pieces only he could solve. He didn't dream of medals or glory. He dreamed of gears fitting clean, engines purring right. He once rebuilt a Harley from scrap parts just to prove it could be done. When the war came, Wally didn't ask to fight. He asked to fix. The Army obliged. They sent him to the 6th Infantry Division with a wrench and a helmet and told him to keep the jeeps running. He did more than that. He fell in love with them. By the time they reached Luzon, his jeep was named Claire, after the girl he never got the nerve to date. He painted her name in white across the hood, just under the .30 caliber mount. She wasn't fast, but she was steady, stubborn, and weirdly responsive, like she had a soul buried beneath the steel. Wally often joked she handled better than most officers. In his left breast pocket, wrapped in wax paper, he kept a small spiral notebook. Not a military log, not orders, just thoughts, observations, what he called the engine gospel. He wrote about everything the jeeps did that shouldn't have been possible. He'd seen Claire climb a hillside at a 40-degree angle without losing traction. He'd once driven her through a waist-high creek when everyone else said she'd stall out. He logged each moment like scripture. Axle angles, traction tricks, emergency repairs done with wire and stubbornness. His entries weren't technical manuals. They were prayers of motion. Claire took a direct hit to the fender today, he wrote on March 9th. We kept moving. Bent steel don't stop belief. Others saw him as a kind of mechanical mystic, grinning in the rain, oil on his hands, coaxing broken things back to life. His best friend, Private Mike Sorensen, said Wally talked to machines like they were scared horses. Easy, girl. Let's try that ignition again. Just you and me now. But war doesn't care about poetry. During a supply run toward Balit Pass, Claire got stuck in a ravine. The slope was slick with monsoon rain, and the mud swallowed the tires like wet cement. Wally cursed under his breath, not at the jeep, but at the hill, as if it had betrayed him. Shellfire cracked in the distance, sharp and rising. Mike slid down beside him, panting. We leave her. Wally shook his head. We dig. And dig they did. For 7 hours. They used helmets, bare hands, pieces of a blown-out fence post. Every inch forward was bought with sweat and silence. At one point, Wally stopped, stared at Claire, and muttered, This ain't Detroit. It's faith that keeps the wheels moving. They got her out. They made the run. They brought back ammunition and morphine to a squad pinned under mortar fire. That supply run saved lives, but no one wrote that in the official records. A month later, a sniper's round caught Wally through the windshield. It was a clean shot just above the dashboard as he was turning onto a slope. Claire coasted to a stop, her driver already slumped. Mike carried Wally's body back under cover, but before he left the jeep, he opened the glove box and took the diary. Claire didn't die that day. She was patched and driven again. She made her final run carrying 5 wounded men to safety through a shell-blasted gulch. When the medics opened the door, the diary was on the passenger seat, sealed in wax paper. Mike had tucked it there. It eventually made its way back to Missouri. Wally's father read it page by page in his garage, tears mixing with engine oil. The Army never gave Wally a medal. But somewhere, in a museum that displays jeeps of the Pacific Campaign, there's a quote engraved on a brass plate beneath one of the battered hoods. We weren't gods, but we made machines climb like they believed we were. General Kiyoshi Shimada sat beneath a slatted awning of split bamboo, sipping tea that had long gone lukewarm. The mug trembled slightly in his hand, though not from fear, only from the ceaseless rumble of distant artillery echoing across Luzon's ridges. He wore his uniform with the pride of a bygone era, sleeves crisp even in the jungle heat. On the table before him lay maps hand-drawn by scouts and engineers, charts marked with red symbols for elevation, green for terrain type, and black for all the places geography would supposedly hold the enemy back. You see, he explained to the cluster of young staff officers gathered around him, this is elephant grass. Taller than a man, denser than a forest. Vehicles cannot pass through elephant grass. They nodded in unison, pencils poised but never scratching paper. None dared contradict him. Not even Lieutenant Omura, who had returned just that morning from a reconnaissance mission near the eastern approach. He had seen tracks in the grass, fresh tire marks, and a metal fuel can abandoned near a ravine. But he said nothing. Shimada's voice, calm and absolute, drowned all doubt. The only man who dared speak was Captain Masaki. Tall, sharp-eyed, and stubborn to a fault, Masaki had served under Shimada for 2 years, but had never learned the art of silence. "Sir," he began carefully, "with respect, I've seen the jeeps with my own eyes. They carry mortars, stretchers, even supply crates. They're small, yes, but they move like water around obstacles." Shimada frowned. Not in anger, but with the disappointment of a teacher hearing foolishness from a once promising student. "Do not confuse scattered accidents with strategic capability, Masaki. These are tools of desperation, not doctrine. Machines cannot replace the jungle." "But they are replacing it," Masaki replied, "or at least ignoring it." Around them, the jungle breathed heavily. Cicadas screamed from the canopy, and a burst of gunfire crackled in the valley. Masaki leaned over the table, his finger pointing to a gap on the map, what was once believed to be an impassable stretch of ravine and scrub. "They came through here, sir." Not by road, but by force of will. One team even scaled the slope in reverse gear. Shimada did not look. He tapped his teacup gently and turned to his officers. "The Americans," he said slowly, "believe machines are spirits. Let them worship their false gods. We will trust in the land." That evening, Masaki returned to his outpost with a sick knot in his stomach. His men respected him, but they respected the chain of command more. They dug in where the orders said to, laid mines where road signs once pointed, and braced for a frontal assault. But the attack never came from the front. On the 4th day, at dawn, the trees behind their eastern flank erupted with motion. Jeeps, 5 of them, burst through the foliage like wolves in a sheepfold. They carried machine guns and soldiers who had memorized every turn of the terrain. The roadblocks had been meaningless. The maps, outdated. The Americans had studied not paths, but possibilities. By noon, the entire eastern defense had crumbled. Mortars fell in deadly arcs from unexpected angles. Shimada's command post was overrun within hours. His staff scattered. His maps, once sacred, were trampled under tires and boots. Captain Masaki, wounded but alive, watched it unfold from a crater with a broken radio and a shattered wrist. He knew this wasn't just a tactical failure. It was doctrinal collapse. A generation's worth of military thinking undone by 4 wheels and an engine. After the war, Masaki submitted a report to the Reconstruction Ministry. It was never published, but in his personal diary, he wrote of that hill and the men who died on it, some believing in maps, others in motion. "We didn't lose because we lacked courage. We lost because we obeyed maps more than we observed hills. The only thing more dangerous than the enemy's machines was our refusal to believe in them." Thomas "Tank" Radley looked nothing like the men who marched into battle with rifles slung over their shoulders. He had broad hands, scarred by years of labor in the small Ohio garage where he had learned to mend farm trucks and tractors. At 26, he was younger than his weariness suggested, but his spine bent with the weight of engines that had been lifted too many times, and his eyes carried a distance that came not from combat, but from watching men and machines collapse around him. His assignment in Leyte was not to fight, but to keep the fighting moving. In the Pacific Theater, that meant one thing: keeping the jeeps alive. His workshop was nothing more than a patched canvas tent pitched over a dirt pit, with rusted toolboxes scattered on crates and oil pooled in the ground like black rainwater. The front line shifted like a restless tide, and the tent moved with it, always close enough to hear the echo of artillery but never far enough to feel safe. When jeeps rolled in, they were not the proud, grinning icons of propaganda posters. They limped, coughing smoke, wheels torn, windshields shattered. Some came back with bullet holes stitched across their hoods. Others had been blasted apart and dragged in pieces by desperate infantrymen. To headquarters, these machines were statistics: lost, replaced, written off. To Radley, each was a patient on a table, and his hands the only thing between silence and one more chance to move. The rhythm of his days was brutal but steady. Engines cracked and stuttered under his touch. He had learned to improvise with whatever scraps the battlefield offered. When fuel was gone, he showed drivers how to siphon gasoline from wrecked tanks and enemy vehicles, catching the precious liquid in battered canteens. When drive belts snapped, he cut parachute cords into strips and wound them until the pulleys turned again. Axle pins were hammered out of spent shell casings. Fan belts became stitched leather straps scavenged from ruined boots. He was not an inventor. He was not a genius. He was, in his own words, just too stubborn to let the war win. The men who came to him with broken jeeps rarely remembered his name. To them, he was just the mechanic, a grease-smeared figure hunched under the hood at all hours, lanterns burning through the damp Philippine nights. But their survival depended on him, whether they admitted it or not. A medic could not reach the wounded without a jeep. A mortar crew could not haul its tubes without one. A commander could not deliver his orders, nor could supplies reach the front without wheels that turned. Soldiers prayed for luck, officers prayed for victory, but all of them moved on the faith that men like Radley would keep the machines breathing. Still, he hated it. He hated the endless racket of engines revving against the growl of distant artillery, hated the way every sound was swallowed by the jungle only to return louder, more frenzied. He hated how each jeep became a story of sacrifice, an ambulance, a shield, a coffin, before it became a wreck under his tools. He hated most of all that every time he finished patching one back together, another limped in, carrying new blood on its seats. One night, when the perimeter shook with distant shelling, a group of soldiers brought in a Japanese prisoner of war, his arm bound in rough bandages. The man had been an engineer before the war, captured while repairing an anti-aircraft gun. He was thin, his uniform torn, but his eyes were sharp. They gave him water and left him near the tent while waiting for the medics. By the light of a flickering lamp, he watched Radley work. Radley was hunched over an engine block ripped from its chassis, his forearms straining as he twisted a wrench deep into the ribs of steel. Sparks hissed where a cracked piston met his improvised repair. Oil dripped on his hands, already blackened to the wrist. His face was a mask of silence. No words, no curses, just the rhythm of breath and the metallic heartbeat of his labor. The prisoner leaned closer, whispering through the interpreter, "In my country, only factories do what you do." This is impossible. Radley didn't even look up. The war had taken his patience for awe or disbelief. He simply braced his boot against the block, forced the wrench one more time, and listened as the engine coughed, stuttered, and finally roared back to life under the dark sky. The jeep would move again. Men would live because of it. And then another would arrive, broken, waiting for his hands. Thomas Radley set down the wrench, wiped his forearm against his brow, and lit another lantern. There was no pride, no victory in his work, only necessity and the unshakable will to see steel turn once more. Thomas didn't answer. He just twisted the wrench until the engine breathed again. Colonel Daiji Okabe had lived half his military life preparing for a battle just like the one at Ridge 39. A veteran of Manchuria and New Guinea, he understood terrain better than most commanders. And Ridge 39 was perfect. Nature had carved it for defense. A narrow, spine-like trail ran up the back of the hill, lined with natural choke points, camouflaged foxholes, and sniper nests with lines of fire that crisscrossed the entire ascent. To Okabe, the ridge wasn't just a strategic position. It was a fortress blessed by the gods of geography. For months, his garrison had fended off American patrols that tried to test the perimeter. Foot soldiers struggled to climb even with ropes, their boots sucked down by mud or blocked by freshly felled trees. Jungle rot, dengue fever, and ambushes did the rest. Aerial reconnaissance passed over the hill daily, but no bombing run came. It puzzled some officers, but Okabe believed it was a sign of caution. "They fear what they cannot climb," he once told a junior lieutenant with grim pride. Then came the leaflet drop. Small parachute-pinned papers drifted from the sky one morning after a loudspeaker broadcast declared the Americans would soon be delivering supplies, by jeep, onto Ridge 39. The claim drew open laughter from the bunkers. "Jeep? Up here," one soldier cackled. "Only monkeys and ghosts can climb this hill." Okabe allowed the jokes but didn't share the laughter. He knew American arrogance, but even they weren't so foolish as to send motor vehicles up a cliffside. It had to be a bluff. Still, he took no chances. Snipers were ordered to double-check their scopes and refit their nests. Mines and tripwires were reburied. He sent engineers to flood the narrow trail with oil, mud, and debris, ensuring even foot traffic would suffer. For the final line of defense, he approved the burying of 3 artillery shells wired to a remote fuse near the midpoint of the trail, a trap designed to collapse the slope onto itself. No one would pass. At dawn, 3 days later, distant jungle noises began to shift. The usual hum of insects gave way to a rhythmic crunching sound, like claws on wet wood. Spotters saw the treetops shaking, not from airdrop or monkeys, but from something heavier. Okabe raised his binoculars. Then came the first silhouette. It wasn't on the trail. It was 10 meters east, pushing through undergrowth where even foot soldiers hesitated. A jeep, its tires wrapped in mesh, its windshield armored with improvised plates of welded steel, emerged like some squat jungle creature. Behind it, another followed. Then another. "How?" Okabe whispered aloud, frozen. American infantry had forged their own ascent, carving out a former game trail used by wild pigs. With machetes, tree saws, and hand-placed charges, they had created a crawl path in secret. The jeeps didn't drive, they clawed, inch by inch, the lead drivers half out of their vehicles to balance and spot rocks, each one guided by scouts using terrain compass techniques and smuggled Japanese maps captured weeks prior. The Japanese had expected machines to follow roads, but these came like beasts from the foliage. Gunfire erupted. One jeep exploded into flame, hit by a well-placed grenade. Another tipped, trapping its driver beneath. But 5 others surged forward, moving around the resistance like liquid steel. They weren't just delivering troops. They carried mortars, radio teams, and ammunition packs. The moment they breached the rear of the Ridge 39, they did the unthinkable. They fired downhill onto Okabe's own men, collapsing defensive lines from the back. Panic rippled through the ranks. Soldiers scrambled to reposition, but their emplacements had all faced uphill. The mines were useless. The snipers had no targets behind them. In 30 minutes, the Ridge's carefully engineered defense turned into a death trap for its defenders. Colonel Okabe stood silently as the radio reported the rear lines disintegrating. He didn't yell. He didn't order a last stand. He simply took off his cap, walked to the command dugout, and wrote the surrender order by hand. He wasn't ashamed of his soldiers. They had done what doctrine demanded. But the world had changed, and no doctrine could hold back a machine that thought like a soldier, climbed like an animal, and was driven by the ingenuity of boys from towns he'd never heard of. He watched the jeeps come to rest near the summit, engines humming, their drivers leaning out with grins that made him feel older than he was. For all his medals, all his maps, and all his pride, Okabe had misjudged the future. And the future had wheels. The hill never gave up. It was taken by something we refused to believe could climb. In the humid underbelly of a reinforced bunker outside Manila, far removed from the muddy trenches and howling mortar fire, Sergeant Masaru Fujiwara worked surrounded by static, wires, and uncertainty. A pale bulb dangled above his desk, swaying from vibrations above ground. Shadows danced over the radio console as Masaru adjusted the dials with the precision of a surgeon. He wasn't a frontline soldier, nor did he carry a rifle, but he bore a different kind of weapon, one tuned to the whispers of an invisible battlefield. Each day blurred into the next. Masaru barely saw the sun. His world was filled with dots and dashes, intercepted voices, and the rustle of translation sheets. Cigarette butts piled near the transmitter. His uniform, once crisp, now bore the same sweat stains for a week. He'd memorized American call signs by ear, learning to tell Oklahoma from Ohio by the cadence alone. The other men called it obsession. He called it vigilance. It was late, close to 0200 hours, when a burst of English filled the headphones, casual and laughing, unlike the usual clipped brevity of battle reports. Masaru adjusted the gain. The voices were clear, confident. A young soldier joked about Filipino coconuts. Another teased him about missing a girl back home. Then the phrase came, sudden and sharp. Jeeps over Monkey Ridge complete. No casualties. Repeat, vehicles made it through. Masaru froze. He pulled the headphones off and stared at the machine as if it had betrayed him. Monkey Ridge was not a path. It was a wall, a vertical rise of bamboo, vines, and shale. Even Japanese mules had been unable to navigate it. They'd lost 2 supply teams trying to build a trail around it. It had been deemed impenetrable by all sides. And yet, that voice had not lied. Masaru knew its tone. The slurred drawl, the casual slang. It belonged to a corporal he'd tracked for weeks during the Luzon advance. The man had once bragged on air about fixing a Jeep with a bootlace and bubble gum. The accent was Ohioan. The bravado, unmistakably real. He replayed the recording 3 more times. Then, once more. And finally, gripping the paper tightly in his hands, he rushed to Major Tetsuya's quarters. The major, a sharp-featured man with a permanent frown etched into his brow, blinked groggily as Masaru burst in. "Sir, I've intercepted something." "Monkey Ridge. They've moved jeeps through it." Tetsuya narrowed his eyes. "Impossible," he muttered, pushing the glasses up his nose. "Monkey Ridge has no road. It's bamboo and cliffs. They must be lying." "I'm certain," Masaru pressed. "It's real time." "They're not bluffing, sir. It's not propaganda, just a status update, mid-transmission. They've done it." The major folded his arms, leaning back into his cot. "Let me ask you, Sergeant," he said slowly. "If I forward this claim and it's wrong, what happens?" "HQ will demand proof. And if I say an American Jeep climbed Monkey Ridge, I will be labeled a fool." An alarmist Masaru's mouth opened to protest, but the major raised a hand. "Bamboo and cliffs," he repeated. "Machines cannot climb air. Perhaps they flew one in on a crane." He chuckled bitterly. "You've been in the static too long." The decision was made. The intercept was buried in a folder marked Low Credibility. No reinforcements were sent, no scouts dispatched. Monkey Ridge was still considered a wall. 7 days later, Masaru sat at the same console, his fingers trembling as he intercepted a different frequency, this one in Japanese, from a nearby observation outpost. "Ridge breached. American forces have flanked from above. Small motor vehicles spotted near eastern slope, requesting immediate artillery response. Coordinates." The rest was drowned in feedback. He leaned back slowly in his chair, numb. The jeeps had done it. Not tanks, not bombers, jeeps. The very thing his superior had laughed off. That night, Masaru didn't eat. He didn't speak. He returned to his bunk and took out a piece of writing paper, the kind his mother used to send with pickled plums and stories from Kyoto. He began a letter to her, describing the sound of the American voices, the conviction in their tone, the disbelief in his own command. He described Monkey Ridge in detail. He described the silence that followed the breach. But halfway through the letter, he stopped writing. The shame made the pen heavy. The page remained unfinished. He folded it neatly, tucked it into his journal, and never sent it. "We lost more battles in silence than we ever did in gunfire." The rain fell in sheets outside the crumbling farmhouse, blurring the ridgelines and soaking the abandoned foxholes that once formed the outer defenses of Lieutenant Commander Hiroshi Watanabe's command post. Inside, the former cavalryman moved with deliberate care. The walls of the farmhouse, once a Spanish-built estate, were now plastered with hand-drawn sketches, rearing stallions, saber-wielding riders, even a faded charcoal rendering of the Imperial cavalry charge at Mukden. They were not just decorations, they were memories, ghosts of a military tradition that once defined him. By the dim glow of a lantern, Hiroshi prepared the incense. He did this every evening when he was not out walking the perimeter or overseeing field reports. His hands, though calloused and burned from months in the Pacific sun, remained steady as he lit the stick and placed it before the photograph of his grandfather. The image, curled at the corners from age, showed the elder Watanabe in full ceremonial armor, astride a great black horse, the saber at his hip gleaming like a promise. It had been taken in 1905, just after the Russo-Japanese War, when the cavalry still held honor in its saddle. Hiroshi had believed in that honor all his life. He had trained on horseback as a youth, been praised for his balance and sharp instincts in cavalry school. When mechanization began creeping into the Imperial Army, Hiroshi resisted, not with anger, but with principle. Horses, he believed, were not just transport. They were companions, symbols, living expressions of the soldier's will. Machines had no breath, no loyalty, no soul. Yet the war had changed. First came the rumors. American trucks crawling over mud without sinking. Motorized units moving supplies through ravines in hours, where it took horse teams days. Then came the sightings. Enemy vehicles cresting hills no one believed scalable, appearing in valleys thought impassable. Hiroshi had dismissed them at first. A trick, a fluke. But the pattern grew. The terrain itself no longer guaranteed victory. And that, more than the guns or the airstrikes, unsettled him. The turning point came quietly, almost without ceremony. A captured American Jeep, salvaged by one of their patrols, was towed into the compound by a team of weary soldiers. It was scratched and splattered with blood and mud, but mostly intact. The radiator still hissed with residual heat. Bullet holes peppered the passenger side, but the tires were whole. Its front end bore a crude stencil of a grinning dog and the words, "Hell Pupper," scrawled in English across the hood. Hiroshi stood outside, unmoving, as the soldiers parked the vehicle inside the barn where cavalry once slept. He dismissed the men and stepped forward, alone. The Jeep was smaller than he imagined, not monstrous but squat, almost humble in its shape. Still, it exuded a presence. It was not just a vehicle. It was an idea, made real. As he stared at the dented hood, steam curling from its sides, he felt the same sensation he once had before a charging horse: alertness, fear, awe. He extended his hand, touched the warm metal. Cold rain fell on his shoulders, soaking the back of his uniform, but he did not flinch. The Jeep had no mane, no heartbeat, no soft eyes. But it had survived. It had moved with purpose. It had carried men through fire and returned. His thoughts drifted to his grandfather's saber, now tucked inside a canvas wrap in his pack. It had not been drawn in months. His men no longer rode, nor drilled in the old cavalry patterns. They dug. They repaired radios. They read reports of mechanized units cutting through terrain once guarded by spirits and hills. His second-in-command, Lieutenant Suda, stepped into the barn, hesitant. "Sir? Shall I call for a mechanic to begin disassembly?" Hiroshi didn't answer at first. He looked at the Jeep again, this time not as an enemy's tool, but as something else, something inevitable. He finally spoke, voice low but clear. "We worshipped the wrong legs." Then he turned fully to Suda and added with the weight of generations folding into steel and silence, "What we called honor, they turned into horsepower." Major Charles Kincaid had ridden in jeeps across 4 islands, Guadalcanal, Leyte, Mindoro, and now Luzon. He never drove them. He was too lanky, too awkward, and his knees banged into the dashboard when he tried. But he rode shotgun often enough to consider the passenger seat his second desk. Now, as his convoy moved up the ridgeline overlooking a Philippine valley dotted with coconut groves and broken huts, Kincaid sat cross-legged in the front seat of a mud-caked Willys MB, scribbling in a leather-bound notebook while the suspension jostled beneath him. The engine hummed like an old dog panting happily. In the rear, infantrymen chuckled over a deck of cards, their helmets tilted back, shirts dark with sweat. For once, there was no gunfire in the air. The war, or at least this corner of it, seemed to be tipping, not in a single thunderclap of victory, but in a slow, grinding shift like tectonic plates finally moving. Village by village, ridge by ridge, the Americans advanced, and behind every tale of assault or liberation was one constant presence: the Jeep. Kincaid had been tasked by the Pentagon with compiling a logistics report. Nothing glamorous, just figures: engine durability, axle performance under tropical strain, tire retention on slippery inclines. But somewhere between the rice paddies and the bombed-out churches, the notebook had shifted. The statistics faded into the margins. Instead, he found himself writing stories: names of boys who rebuilt carburetors in foxholes, medics who stabilized limbs in bouncing rear beds, mechanics who used parachute cords as engine belts. These weren't machines. They were lifelines, quiet miracles of engineering that had refused to quit when men did. Kincaid remembered one instance on Mindoro. When a Jeep carried a field radio team across an old lava flow at night, the headlights blacked out, the driver navigating by feel and memory. They reached a summit ridge before sunrise, set up communications, and coordinated a surprise artillery strike that saved an entire company. That Jeep was later recovered with its undercarriage nearly torn in half, but it had held just long enough. Now, climbing yet another muddy incline with a dozen more behind him, Kincaid leaned against the windshield frame and watched the jungle part around the vehicle's path. They were moving where no carts ever had, no cavalry ever dared. American doctrine had once said, "Let terrain decide the fight." But the war had rewritten that. Terrain no longer dictated anything, not when you could bring your wheels with you. That night, at a field outpost lit only by oil lanterns and the distant crack of sporadic rifle fire, Kincaid sat with his legs crossed on a rusted ammunition crate, his Jeep parked a few yards away, the engine still clicking from heat. He stared at the radio transmitter before him and considered how to summarize what he'd seen. He had 100 pages of field notes, dozens of interviews, charts, statistics, but none of them captured the truth. He keyed the mic and spoke slowly, as if weighing every word against the gravity of silence. Final transport report follows. Luzon, front operational. Motorized success across terrain once considered inaccessible. No major losses in convoy mobility. Final conclusion attached in line below. He paused, looked toward the Jeep, now sleeping in the dark like a faithful animal at rest, and added one final line. It wasn't technical. It wasn't quantifiable. But it was true. The Japanese lost faith in the horse too late. By the time they believed, the wheels were already at their gates. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It highlights themes of technological advancement, cultural perspective, and the shock of innovation during wartime. Its purpose is to raise awareness, provoke thought, and inspire reflection on how progress reshapes power, perception, and history.